Greetings, fellow classmates from the Wilmette Institute. This is our Unit 8 of the Bahai Theology class and course, and today's topic is Bahai Free Will, concepts from the Bahai faith on free will, such as are humans helpless, or do they have great but hidden divine power, and do we even have free will? The presentation's organized around chaos today. It's just an acronym to remember some of the points we're going to cover. And we'll begin with commands as in following commands like our animal selves or our animal friends, where most of our free will has got to do with instinct and learning as we grow, but there's not a lot of what we philosophers consider free will, which is not just choice, but also the ability to change our future. In the words of Hannah Arendt, harmonics, acceptance or attention, obedience, and then surrender. And the apex of the entire system and acronym is acceptance. And this is like a pyramid, because if you go down a step to the left, you hit harmonics, and then you have complete obedience to commands, which is both full circle to surrender, where you also through obedience have complete surrender of the will, or what will there is. So let's begin. We'll try to go through these more quickly, and this final one has really got more supporting quotations about all of the points that we cover here to show how the Baha'i scriptures and writings support the ideas here. Initially we'll start with science and then move to spirit. Science on the command side is the question, is there really such a thing as free will in human beings? And I took a little different approach here. The scientific approach says, no, there's not, because we have this thing called Big Bang causality, which means all of the causes that started with the initial Big Bang under our command category are the same as not having free will at all, because they basically say that we are the results of those causes, and our effects will be the result of additional causes at the quantum and molecular and atomic levels. This is a little simpler in that we're taking a mathematical approach to it. I know it doesn't look simple, but it really is. This is beginning on this side is a regression equation, and it just follows the mathematical techniques of regression elimination, or least squares, the iterative methods, Newton's, Julius sets, gradient descent with dependencies, and many of these others. All this says is the same thing as Sherlock Holmes said. When you have eliminated all which is impossible, then whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And that's what this mathematic does. It basically says why your initial condition of an assumption of some kind of free will is beginning with 100% and then is decremented by variables that might take away that free will. And you sum those up and you end up with as many as there are, and I will propose there are thousands in the human soul, spirit, mind, and body and brain, and then an error term at the end. But that's the same process of elimination that Arthur Conan Doyle was talking about, which is, let's look at the initial assumption that we have 100% free will. Then that's what the mathematics does, and that's what the logic does. And it's the second equation is just the idea of what are the factors, and we'll look at summing all those n's, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then that will give us free will minus any factors that argue that we don't have a choice in that case, so there is no free will. So let's look at those a few of those no choice factors, or deterministic factors that reduce our choices. God's will is number one. If we're surrendered to God's will, we will repeat the meditation. We'll get to this in the acceptance section of techniques to get rid of the remaining free will that we have, so that we're a leaf in the wind of God's will. But he says, for instance, if it be thy will, grant that my movement and stillness may be wholly directed by thee. And that's kind of an ultimate prayer and meditation, where our thought spheres or thought bubbles are centered entirely in God's will, and other surrounding electrons around that atom are decreased more and more with these techniques of prayer and meditation until we are immersed totally in the presence and will of God. And it's all there, and we can see it in the quotes later. But that's one thing that reduces what we'd call free will. There are others. Physics, we can't do things outside of the laws of physics with our bodies. We can't do more than the atoms allow us to do. We're programmed from birth with genetics, as well as social programming and social programming. There's ignorance, things when we make our choices, but we have imperfect information. We can't see into the future. Habits, of course, drivers from the past, received opinions, in other words, following commands and opinions of other people, not our own. Lack of options. All these things, constraints, chance, all these other things take away from our free will, what we call our free will, until we have so many of these in the equation that what is the real percent left that we're really making free choices? A lot of times we go through a day sleepy and do what our habits and our to-do lists require us to do. And the big one here, which is spoken of in the eunuch, is reward and punishment or carrots and sticks. How many of us have free will to say, no, today I think I'll go drive off a cliff? Well, we could do that. That's true. And that's part of our programming and part of other thought spheres other than the will of God. But we mostly try to chase carrots and avoid sticks. We want rewards and we want to avoid punishment. That's the way we're programmed. And so that removes some of those factors. So that's just an initial thought saying that under chaos, under the initial conditions, it's the initial condition of assumption of some amount of human free will minus reductions equals resulting condition. So we'll see, on the other hand, on the spiritual side, it's much different. When we do surrender, we become omnipotent, and if we don't, we're stuck with what this little equation of free will, as the animals have, following commands of nature, instead of obedience, following the commands of God. So again, CH is chaos, H is harmonics. So a step above saying, okay, we're following our habits, are the ideas of skill. And there's both physical and spiritual skills in harmonics. You can see when you are programmed and you learn things in your cortex and then drop it down into the unconscious and then finally into the motor cortex, you can be physically in the zone with our athletic harmonics. You know, like the skiing the moguls and going with gravity, tacking against the wind, parasailing, many of these athletic, ice skating, where it's really, you've given in to the will of the zone and you're not making individual choices and decisions with a free will, you're going with the flow. Well, there's a spiritual side of that too, going with the flow of God's will. So this is just a sign of what the spiritual side of freedom from free will. And we talk about freedom and we think that freedom means free will. But under harmonics, here's another thought you might consider, and that is, are we talking about freedom to do A, B, C, and D, or freedom from? And that's an example. The example would be, what does independent wealth mean? Does that mean we can do whatever we want because we have so much wealth and we're extremely wealthy and that means we're free? Or does it mean we're free from wealth? In other words, we're free from the chains that money put on us because we're not dependent on them. And so it's a sneaky paradox that freedom may be surrender. Freedom equals surrender. And in spiritual side, that's even more powerful, because free will might be freedom from doing what we please, or freedom from will, letting go and releasing and surrender what human will we have. And on the spiritual side, it's not reduced like the command side of animals. We are godlike divine beings on the spiritual side. And when the Bab says surrender, he says, which is shocking in terms of spiritual free will, he says the purpose of the human will is to surrender it to God's will. Any other use of this great power is illicit. So in other words, he speaks of it as a great power, harmonizing with the will of God. This all begins at the top of the pyramid with acceptance. Acceptance of our manifestation for our age, acceptance of the will of God, and our complete attention on God. Excuse me for my pronunciation. I have a speech impediment from throat cancer, as some of you have talked about in the chats in the past, so I apologize for some of my pronunciation of these words. So let's jump up to acceptance and attention. You'll see in some of these interesting, fun little videos that we're adding in here that attention and acceptance are like thought bubbles. You know, there's planets and there's molecules, and there's a whole technique here of attention, which is remembrance, forgetting anything but the beloved. And this is a type of prayer and meditation, and we're free to do whatever, as Baha'is, type of meditation we want. There's not a prescribed technique, you know, like yoga. But there are many, as we'll see in the writings, suggestions and hints about how to free ourselves from all but the will of God, forget all else, and remember my love. So as you go throughout the day, you think of thoughts as these spheres or planets or atoms, and they're coming at you like a series of planets or spheres, thought spheres. What if you have one big giant thought sphere in the center? All the little ones come all together and create a big one, a giant sphere. That's focusing our attention entirely on the beloved and letting go of our will for God's will, so we become all-powerful. It's a divine driving. It's like a leaf in the wind. We'll see many of the quotes at the end that point to this and how the process works. But this, again, is a technique if you want to get into continual joy, bliss, and never worrying, just completely going with God's will, where it even says, if it be thy will, grant that my movement and stillness may be wholly directed by thee. That is the true leaf in the wind. And just think right now, okay, what am I thinking of right now? Geez, I got to do this and that. Okay, there's this and that. All these little spheres are going around, which are the thoughts and our focus. The Baha'i women, I saw a video of the Baha'i women in India talk about what is it to have a continuous thought sphere, only one, on the beloved. And they say we learn it because we carry things on our head in baskets sometimes. And if we go about life doing all our to-do list and the other things, that never leaves us. We always have that attention because we learn that it's second nature and it's always top of mind. Literally, it's top of head and top of mind. So this is another technique. And in terms of thought spheres, we can think of it, as we see it in these videos, as a large central sphere and then other smaller ones, or thousands of smaller ones, either coming into one big one or centering continually on the beloved. Now, free will has been described philosophically and theologically across centuries, although Hannah Arendt says that before Aquinas and in the old days of Plato, they didn't speak of will, thinking of will as a mental power. They thought of will more of as strength. And in the Bible it says, love God with all your, your soul and your heart, and not your will, but your strength. Uses the word, translates it as the word strength. So Hannah suggests that memory is a power, or a power of the past, and thought is our power of the present, and will is our power of the future. It's where we learn what we want to do, and we use the power of our will to create the future. That the will is the power of the future and about the future and for the future. So you can see some of these past and future shadows coming at us. And in the videos, this is static, but in the videos you can see like this, where these spheres are coming at us. And the goal of this kind of meditation is to obviously accept not only the manifestation prophet, read his writings, and then become driven by those writings completely in the laws, where he says, the pen of thy might drive my every action. That's complete surrender of the will. And if it wasn't difficult, and it wasn't tough, and it wasn't hard with all these other millions of thoughts bouncing around, it's hard enough to turn them off just to get to sleep, let alone to have a central focus. It wouldn't be worth it. I mean, nothing good ever comes easy, and that's the ultimate good, is this type of surrender. So the last two, obedience, is fairly self-explanatory, where he says, obey my laws for the love of my beauty. And just as harmonics sits between acceptance and command, giving up, obedience sits between acceptance and complete surrender. So it's another stepwise progress to complete destruction or freedom, or forgetting the human will to be immersed in the will of God. And so that there's those middle steps as we go through. And interesting enough, it comes full circle. command and surrender are very similar. One, we're completely surrendered to our animal side. The other, we're completely surrendered to the will of God. Either way, we're either way, right? We don't have a whole lot of will, right? When you look at the math of it, they're under submission, surrender. We'll look at subordinate quotations, but under this, obey the laws for love of my beauty. Here's just one where Baha'u'llah, which is astonishing, where Baha'u'llah said, in the times of pre-existence, before our soul even surrounded our body, it's like in the outside of time, sanctified from time and place and energy and matter, from stem. Awestruck, he listened as I gave utterance to the three most holy words. O friends, prefer not your will to mine. Never desire that which I have not desired for you, and approach me not with lifeless hearts defiled with worldly desires and cravings. Baha'u'llah. So that's sort of the ultimate pre-existence outside of time and space, where we don't need the human will facility to create the future, that we're entirely driven by the love and will of God. So finally, that we'll look at a few of our submission and surrender supporting quotations here to support the main points we've just gone through. As I said, it takes us back to the beginning again, where our commands that drove us, including as children, where we are completely dependent on our parents, and then we learn some amount of independence. We investigate the truth, and we follow our hearts and our souls. But there's a lot of instinctive programming and habit that go on. And I mean, people make fun of other people by saying they're sheeple. Well, we're all sheeple. We all follow our habits and our to-do lists, don't we? And we all chase carrots and run away from sticks, don't we? But there's a little thing in there, a little instinct that can become bigger and bigger and bigger, as we said, with these little pieces coming together into a gigantic central thought sphere, which is immersion in the will of God. And many of these quotes are going to cover that. So without further ado, thank you so much for taking the time. Let's look at a few of these supporting quotations to close, and then think of the whole idea of chaos here, and how does it all relate to submission, complete submission in the will of God, and the techniques that get us there, to continual divine power and omnipotence by not having our own wills and desire, but being the complete reflection of His will and desire, the omnipotent, all-powerful will of the divine. You can stop the video and pause anywhere. This last quote said, Abdu'l-Baha said, the servant can't do anything according to his own will, which is amazing. I want to keep this down to less than 20 minutes, so I'm going to let these go a little faster. This is the one we talked about, that my movement and stillness may be wholly directed by thee, by Baha'u'llah. I have no will of my own, O my Lord. So if you want to read these in detail, please just stop the video and continue on reading. But these are the backup sort of bibliography writings that we talked about during the video. And finally, this absolutely beautiful one, that the angels of heaven record.